Okay, so any questions from where we left off last time? Okay, so let me start. If you have questions, please stop me. So what I was doing yesterday was to give you a physical setup that actually realizes that schematic picture that we had of measurement. And this is the kind of measurement that I'm going to call projective measurement, okay? To contrast it with something else which will follow, okay? But you can see why the name projective, because basically you're visualizing the observable in terms of a set of orthogonal projectors, and the act of measurement collapses you down to one of this set of orthogonal projectors, or you can think of this as the action of one of these projectors on the state, right? So this is what is called a projective measurement, right? So this experimental setup goes back to 1922, the very early heydays of quantum theory, when quantum mechanics was being developed in various ways. So like I said, you can think of this as a beam of particles, some fundamental particles, though the original experiment had actually silver atoms, but you can think of this as some fundamental particles like electrons, which are sent through an inhomogeneous magnetic field. We just define some physical direction. So this is what I call the Z. This is the Y. The beam is traveling along the Y, right? And then there's a screen which captures these particles, right? The idea is that because of the presence of something called spin, right, which, like I said, is an intrinsic angular momentum, right? Each electron, let's think of this as just a beam of electrons, behaves like a tiny dipole. What's a dipole? It's just a bar magnet, right? So a tiny bar magnet with some what's called magnetic moment M, okay? Now the point is, if this magnetic moment M, okay, so the next thing to say is that because of this magnetic moment, so when a magnetic dipole is in a region of non-uniform magnetic field, it experiences a force, right? It experiences a deflection. So these electrons will get deflected. So let me just say they experience a force, and the force that they will experience is along the direction of the inhomogeneity, which is the Z direction here, right? They will experience a force along the Z direction, right? Which causes the beam to deflect. So essentially it causes the beam to spread out, right? So let me say it causes them to deflect, and this causes the beam to spread out. Now, if this M is uniformly oriented with respect to the Z direction, right? Then we expect a uniform spread of the beam, right? So this was what was expected classically, so to speak, that this M does not have, but this M is oriented in a continuous way. So like I said yesterday, the force is indeed proportional to cosine theta, which means the larger is the theta, the smaller is the larger is the deflection, right? And the smaller is the theta, the smaller is the deflection, right? So this is indeed, or did I say that the other way around? The smaller is the theta, the larger is the deflection. That's what I meant to say, yeah. So this is indeed proportional to the angle that it makes with the z-axis, right? So this kind of spreads out into a uniform thing like this. Is what was the expected classical outcome, that you have a narrow beam coming in, and this narrow beam is somehow going to spread out like this, right? And cause this patch, a uniform patch on some screen, right? However, what was actually observed was this. You had this narrow beam coming in, and then this led to two distinct patches like this, which were away from the center, right? So offset from the center, right? So this was a big puzzle solved a couple of years later when the idea of spin was really developed by Uhlenbeck and I forget the other person, and they won a Nobel Prize for that. So today, the way we understand this is the reason that this beam splits like this into two distinct patches here. The reason that you observe two distinct patches on the screen here is because the spin orientation is not a continuous thing, right? That the spin can exactly take only one of two values. Okay, so but the actual outcome thing. You have to. So, and the explanation for this is to say that the spin is actually quantized. Not every possible orientation of the spin is allowed. And today we understand that there are exactly two possible orientations. And we call these as plus minus. So we can say one is parallel and the other is anti-parallel to the field. So one is up along Z, the other is down along Z, right? So parallel and anti-parallel. And correspondingly, the magnitude of the spin angular momentum, one can work out the expressions, will basically be plus minus h bar by 2, right? So this is the gist of what the Stern-Gerlach setup does, right? Now, instead of a, so let me now again abstract this out, right? So what has the Stern-Gerlach setup done? So let me call this SGZ, okay? So there's an incoming beam of electrons, right? And the outcome is to actually, now, what is the orientation of the spin of this incoming beam of electrons? Obviously, it's randomized, right? But what quantization tells us is that not all orientations are possible, only two orientations are possible. So it's randomly distributed over these two orientations, namely parallel and anti-parallel to Z, right? But once you pass it through the setup, what happens? These electrons either go up to one patch or down to the other patch, right? So, and these two correspond to basically the plus half or the plus h bar by 2 and the minus h bar by 2, or parallel and anti-parallel to the field, right? So this is what happens when you have a beam of electrons, right? But now what happens? So you will observe both, right? You will observe some fraction of these electrons being observed in this patch. That's why you have these two patches, right? There's some fraction of particles going here and some fraction of particles going here. It should ideally be a very narrow sort of patch like this, right? On the screen, it should ideally be a very narrowly distributed peak. But in practice, well, you not only have a force along the Z, you should have forces along other directions because of the laws of electromagnetics, right? So there will be a spread, right? Anyway, the spread needn't bother us. That's an experimental quirk, if you will. But the key point is this two distinct values, right? And these are what we refer to as up and down, parallel, anti-parallel, plus minus h bar by 2. Now, what happens if I send a single electron through the Stern-Gerlach setup? So it's just one electron now, right? Now what will happen? Yes. What do we expect to see? Instead of a beam,
Any one of the port.
sorry?
At any one value plus h by 2 or minus h by 2.
Yeah, so the idea is you will either get plus h bar by 2 or you will get minus h bar by 2, right? So the electron either goes to the upper patch of the screen or it goes down to the lower patch in the screen, right? And this happens with some probability, which we can call P of plus and P of minus, or P of plus half and minus half, right? And how do we get to these probabilities? We know what to do, right? So the incoming state, right, can be described in some sense. So it depends, right? So it depends on how I prepare these electrons, right? But if my incoming state was in this kind of uniform superposition of 0 and 1, right, which is the same as plus half and minus half, right? Then we know that the probability are given by what? What is the probability of plus half and what is the probability of minus half?
1 by 2, 1 by 2.
Yeah, so they both half, right? So you know that the way to get to the probabilities is to take the overlap of the state with the corresponding eigenstate. These you can either call them 0 and 1 or plus h bar and plus half and minus half. Let me just call this 0. So this is mod 0 squared, which is half, which is also mod inner product with 1 squared, which is half, right? So the point is, when I have a single electron, what the Stern-Gerlach setup is doing is it is, in some sense, it's measuring spin, right? So this essentially works like an apparatus that measures the spin along the z direction. It collapses you to one of these two possibilities of plus half or minus half, or with probabilities, whatever, if this is alpha and beta, then it's mod alpha squared, mod beta squared. So with those probabilities, it is collapsing you down to one of the two possible values of spin. Okay. Now, this is a single electron, but now I have a, if I want to think about this scenario of a beam of electrons, right? How do I describe this scenario mathematically, right? So this beam of electrons is what we call an ensemble of electrons, right? The technical word that we will often use here is ensemble, right? And it is such an ensemble which finally gives you the measurement statistics, right? Because a single measurement will not give you statistics. That just gives you that particular collapse, but that doesn't tell you anything, right? What is the, how do you characterize a measurement? By this probability distribution. To get to that probability distribution, you have to sample. To sample, you need an ensemble. So this ensemble of electrons, when you pass it through a Stern-Gerlach setup and you take these various readings, whether it goes up, down, whatever, and then depending on, so what do these probabilities now translate to? It translates to the fraction of electrons that are going to be seen in the upper half and the fraction of electrons that are going to be seen in the lower half, right? So that fraction is what now these probabilities correspond to. And so that's what gives you this measurement statistics, right? Okay. Now, so any questions so far?
Ma'am.
Yes.
Hello.
Yes, go ahead.
Ma'am, so in single electron case, suppose we are sending an electron and getting plus h by 2.
Yeah.
So does that mean that the electron is having a spin of plus h by 2 before measurement?
This is this is now getting into the kind of questions that the founders of quantum mechanics had in the early days, right? So the answer actually will become clear when I discuss this sequential Stern-Gerlach setup. And what this will really show you is you can't associate such an intrinsic value independent of measurement. Okay, all that you can say is when you measure, the spin value is plus half. When you measure, the spin value is minus half, right? What was that intrinsic value of spin doesn't really have a meaning. Right? It's like saying, does the coin always, it's like saying, yeah, does the dice always give you a particular die, always give you the number 3 when you roll it? Of course it doesn't. It can give you all possible numbers from 1 to 6 with equal probabilities. Does a particular coin always give you a head or a tail? Is there some intrinsic value to this coin toss? There is no intrinsic value. Each time you toss it, it's either a head or a tail. So it appears that that is the best way to understand what quantum theory and measurement are telling us, right? So at this stage, you cannot relate it to anything intrinsic. Now, people have tried to come up with what are called hidden variable models. Okay, I'm just mentioning this name here. We'll maybe see a little bit of this when we discuss the Bell test or the Bell's inequality in a few lectures. We'll come to that. So people thought about what's called a hidden variable change. So this was Einstein's problem with quantum mechanics, right? Like he felt it is incomplete. The idea that you cannot associate this intrinsic value, which is something very deeply ingrained in us because of our understanding of the classical world, right? Much of what we see is the classical world around us. And the idea that these properties must have intrinsic values is very deeply ingrained in us. But this idea of measurement seems to completely violate that intuition, right? So Einstein had this idea that quantum mechanics is not complete, that there is an additional variable which we do not have access to, which is determining whether the outcome is going to be a head or a tail, whether the outcome is going to be a plus half or a minus half, right? So the state that we write down, which is this, right, which is some such superposition of this, is an incomplete description. Okay, and that there should be some additional degree of freedom which we don't have access to, which is somehow determining this. But then now there's enough body of work to show various aspects, like, if there was such a hidden variable, would it be a local theory, etc., etc. I mean, these are now getting into aspects of quantum foundations. But yeah, I can put some references for those of you interested in this kind of foundational ideas and questions. And it is something that people continue to work on and worry about today, right? Okay, so just to make this measurement aspect even more stark, let's do sequential Stern-Gerlach setups. Okay, so what do I mean by that? Now, I have just described a Stern-Gerlach along Z, right? I can equally well think of a Stern-Gerlach setup along X, where the inhomogeneous magnetic field is now along the X direction. Let's continue to think of this as the Y direction. This was Z, right? So I can now think of a setup where I put two bar magnets and make it inhomogeneous and introduce a gradient. So there is some magnetic field along the X now, which is non-uniform. And I can play the same game. I again send a beam of particles, or I send a single electron. And again, it's easy to see that you're going to get the same kind of results, which is that because the spin along X is also quantized, right? It has one of two possible values, plus or minus h bar by 2. So again, you will get a plus h bar by 2 minus h bar by 2, but this time along X, right? So what is input is some random state psi. Now what I want to do is I want to do a sequential. So this is a Stern-Gerlach along X, and it probes or measures the spin along the X direction, right? So now I want to have a sequence of Z and X measurements, okay? And then something interesting happens. Okay, so I start with a Z setup. So the magnetic field is along Z now, the inhomogeneity is along Z. I have an input state, so now I'm going to refer to, so this is what we will do, right? So 0 and 1 are eigenstates of spin along Z. That's our convention, right? and plus minus are the spin eigenstates along X, right? Okay, so my input state is some superposition of 0 and 1, okay? And then what will the first Stern-Gerlach setup do? What will happen? This is a single state now, right? It's a single spin half particle, okay? So I will observe either ket 0 or ket 1, right? Corresponding to plus half or minus half. So let us say that I observe plus half, okay? Which means that I observe the state has collapsed to ket 0, correct? Actually, I'm sorry. Let me do it the other way around, simply because I don't have space to draw on top. Okay. Let's do minus. Okay, let's say that what was observed was minus half. Okay, or minus h bar by 2 was the spin value that was observed. So the collapse is down to the 1 state. Now I want to follow this up with a setup that does Stern-Gerlach along X. Okay, so which means there's an inhomogeneous magnetic field along X. Okay, and I want to now ask what is the spin value along the X direction. So what will happen? What is being input is the state ket 1 now, right? Because this is the post-measurement state, right? The measurement has collapsed the state down to 1, and this state, I now want to pass it through a Stern-Gerlach X setup. So what happens?
Again, a split
Yes.
in X direction and minus X direction.
But split means what? There's a single particle, right? So there's no split.
I mean, yeah, there will be no split. There will be probability either in one direction.
So it will either give you a plus half along X or a minus half along X. What are the two output states corresponding to that?
Plus ket and minus ket.
Yeah, the ket plus and the ket minus, right? So I could either get a plus half along X, which is ket plus, or a minus half along X, which is ket minus. And both of these happen with some probabilities. Note that ket 1 can be written as a superposition of plus and minus, right? What is the superposition? How can I write 1 in terms of plus and minus?
Be 1 by root 2 plus and minus. Plus and minus, yeah.
This or this? Plus minus or plus minus minus?
Plus minus minus.
Okay, good. So I hope everyone sees that. So what this tells me is that the input state is now a uniform superposition of the ket plus and the ket minus, and we had, I think, discussed this, that these are nothing but the eigenstates of the spin X operator corresponding to the plus half and the minus half eigenvalues, right? So these are superpositions of two states which have distinct values of spin along the X. What you started with here as the input was a state which has a distinct value of spin along Z, namely minus h bar by 2. But now this has collapsed down to either this or this. So let's say that now we get the plus state, okay? So it could collapse to either, right? Because it's a uniform superposition, in fact, equally likely to collapse to plus half along X or minus half along X. Now comes the fun part. What am I going to follow this up with? A Stern-Gerlach along Z. Okay. Now what do I expect to see? So the input is now the plus state.
Again, either 0 ket or 1 or 0, yes.
Yeah, so you can have either ket 0 or ket 1, which again corresponds to the plus h bar by 2 along Z and minus h bar by 2 along Z. And now you see both outcomes are equally likely, right? Because plus is an equal superposition, because plus is nothing but 1 over root 2, 0 plus 1, right? So your probability amplitudes are both 1 over root 2 and 1 over root 2. So the probabilities are simply half and half, right? So there you go. Both outcomes are equally likely. So what has happened? We started with a state with completely random spin value, in the sense that was determined, you really couldn't say what is the, spin value until you did the experiment. When you did the experiment, it collapsed down to ket1. And then you said, okay, the spin value is minus half along z. Now you do a spin x measurement, right? And now, okay, it's going to collapse to either of the two, no surprises there. But what is interesting now is when you follow this up with a z again, what you thought was a definite state of spin along z, right? Because ket1 is what? A definite spin state along z, right? That now no longer is a definite spin state along z. The electron or the particle or the system does not carry any memory of the spin value along z. Because what you have done is, in between these two spin z measurements, you have performed a spin x measurement. And in performing the spin x measurement, we seem to have again randomized the spin along the z direction, right? Because now this is a uniform superposition of 0 and 1, right? So just to complete and just to make sure that you guys understand, suppose I had done this, which is I did a Stern-Gerlach along Z first. Okay, there was an arbitrary state, but then it collapsed down to 1. And I follow this up with another Stern-Gerlach along Z. Then what happens? What happens?
Then you would have got one.
Yeah. So you'd have gotten ket1 with what probability?
1.
With probability 1, indeed. So this is why we say ket1 is a state with a definite value of spin along z, or as z or sigma z or whatever you want to call it, right? But if you intersperse this now with an x measurement, then you have destroyed this definiteness. You have thrown it again into a uniform superposition of 0 and 1, and this is no longer valid. If I had not interspersed it with the x measurement, there are no issues. It's just a definite spin z state, right? And I can keep repeating this experiment ad nauseum, and I get always spin 1, right? No surprises there. I can keep repeating this, and I will always get a ket1. Because once I have projected down to ket1, there is no way that I can project to ket0. It's a definite spin minus half state. And no matter how many times I repeat this experiment, I'm only going to get ket1. But having interspersed it with an x, it's like we have lost that memory of that value. And we are again back to a scenario where we could get either outcome, right? Either ket0 or ket1 with equal probabilities. So what does this tell me, right? So if I'm in a state like 0 or 1, right, then I have a definite value for spin along z. I forget whether I call this sz or sigma z, okay, but they're both the same thing. You just have to keep the h bar by 2 in mind as a physical unit, right? But if I'm in one of these two states, then I have a definite value for Sx, right? Or sigma x. Because I can also do this. I can follow this up instead of a Sgz here. If I had done an Sgx, what would I get? This outcome is plus. If I followed this up with an X Stern-Gerlach experiment, what would I get? Yes?
Plus again.
Yeah, you would always get plus, and again with probability 1. So once I'm in a definite state, my probability distribution is a delta distribution. It just has it's 1 at one particular value and all other values are 0, right? But from the delta distribution scenario, when I go between these two bases, right, I'm actually going to a scenario where both outcomes are equally likely, which means that's a uniform probability distribution, right? Because the distribution is now half and half, right? So what this tells me is the fact that I cannot simultaneously assign definite values. So what the sequential setup tells us is that we cannot simultaneously assign definite values to both spin x and sigma z. So what does this remind you of? This, of course, should remind you of the uncertainty principle. So I know that almost all of you have seen the uncertainty principle with reference to position and momentum, that you cannot assign definite values to position and momentum of a quantum system. Well, what I'm telling you is there's nothing special about position and momentum. There are several such sets of observables in quantum theory which satisfy uncertainty principles. And the corresponding observables like sigma x and sigma z are called incompatible observables. Just like position and momentum. Just like how position and momentum are a pair of incompatible observables, and indeed this was the original pair for which Heisenberg stated the uncertainty principle, but in a very simple two-level quantum system with just discrete degree of freedom where it can just take one of two values, we have identified two observables for which you cannot simultaneously assign definite values. And we see this in a very operational way, right, where we have done a sequential experiment, right? If these two observables were compatible, it shouldn't matter whether we intersperse the Z measurement with an X measurement or not. One should not affect the outcome of the other. But the fact that putting in an X measurement completely randomizes the Z measurement again, the Z statistics again, tells you that you cannot assign definite values to both X and Z simultaneously, right? So there is, of course, a formal way of stating this, and the formal way of stating this is actually in terms of the standard deviations, right? And so this is what you will do in the assignment, right, where you will show that the product of these standard deviations or you can think of this in terms of variances, right, is always lower bounded, right, by something, and what that something is actually the expectation value of the commutator. Yeah, I didn't come to expectation value yet, so maybe I'll do that right now. It's basically this quantity, right? This is what you will show in your assignment. And it's a very simple, the interesting thing is that this mathematical statement is just a simple consequence of a very basic theorem in linear algebra, namely the Cauchy-Schwarz inequality, right? So the physics of it is something else. The mathematics of it just simply follows from triangle inequality and Cauchy-Schwarz, right? Two basic inequalities in linear algebra, right? So that's a very nice part about it. But what is this telling you? This is telling us that, look at this quantity here. This is the commutator, right? So what decides whether two observables are compatible or not, right? Okay, so more to the point, what is this inequality telling us, right? So it says that okay, so what is the standard deviation? Okay, maybe I got ahead of myself. Let me just go back a little bit. So let's look at the measurement statistics now. Okay. How do we understand the measurement statistics? So we have associated with some observable A, you have a set of outcomes with probabilities P of AI, right? So when I have a set of probabilities, I can work out a few aspects that characterize this probability distribution, right? What are the things that characterize this? The first thing that I want to know is the expectation value. You can think of this as the average or the mean value, right? And what standard probability theory tells us is that this average should be what? These are my set of outcomes and these are the probabilities. So what is the expectation value or the average? How will I write that down? Yes.
Sigma AI. PAI.
I.
Sigma AI PAI.
Okay. So this expectation I'm going to denote by these two angle brackets. I put the observable in the middle and I denote this by these two angle brackets. Okay. But now we know that this probability is associated with the state, right? As we just saw, depending on whether I'm in ket 0 or ket 1 or ket plus or ket minus, this probability distribution can change, right? In one case, it's a delta distribution. In another case, it's a uniform distribution, right? So it depends on the state. So how do I now relate this back to the state? There should be a way to write down this expectation value, which is, this is a purely probability theory statement. How do I get this from the state? So the way to get this from the state is to note that this probability is actually what? This is modulus psi AI, right? Mod squared. And then I can expand this out as so this is inner product of psi AI and then the complex conjugate, which is nothing but AI psi, right? And now I'm going to do a bit of bracket jugglery. So I'm going to take this number AI and associate it with this projector. You see what is sitting in the middle here is actually a projector, ket AI bra AI, right? So I'm going to rewrite this as ket psi sum over I AI AI AI, okay, ket psi. So what is this quantity that's sitting in the middle here? Yes.
Operator A.
What is this? This is a sum of rank ones with, sorry, yeah.
Trace.
That's the observable. Is that what you're saying?
This is sum of projectors.
It is sum of projectors times AI.
Times AI, right?
So what is that? What are the AIs? They are the eigenvalues of A.
Eigenvalues.
So what is this?
Trace of the matrix.
Sorry?
It's a spectral decomposition of
Operator A. Operator A. It's diagonal representation of operator A.
Indeed, indeed. Yeah. So this is nothing but the spectral decomposition of operator A. Right? Remember, we said that A can be written in terms of its eigenvalues and projectors onto the corresponding eigenstates, and those are nothing but this, right? So this is nothing but a representation of operator A. It's, as someone said, the diagonal representation of operator A, right? So then this is nothing but psi A psi. So what we have shown is this probability theory definition of what the mean value is for a probability distribution P of AI with outcome set AI is nothing but this quantity, which you can think of as the inner product of psi with A psi, right? But more generally, physics students know this as the expectation value. So this is simply, so you can think of this as also sandwiching A between a ket psi and a bra psi. And of course, that should give you a number. If I sandwich a matrix on both sides, one side with a column vector and the other side with a row vector, I should get a number, right? So this is of course well known to the physics guys as the expectation value of observable A in state psi. So this is what I was coming to, that the right hand side of the uncertainty relation is actually an expectation value of the commutator of the two observables. Okay. So what is the left-hand side? That's the second aspect of the statistics that we have to understand. The second aspect of the statistics is the standard deviation. Was there a question? That's the standard deviation or the variance. And how do you define variance? So let me write this as del squared of A. Okay. Note that all of this is with reference to a state, because it's the state that induces the probability distribution. And like I said, for the same observable, I can get two different, completely different distributions. One case a delta and in the other case a uniform distribution, depending on which state I'm measuring in. Okay. So this kind of implied, so some of the old school guys like to put a little psi here, okay, to say that this is the expectation with respect to state psi. Even some of the older books on quantum mechanics that you read will like to put a little psi here, okay, but we may not do that all the time, okay. Yeah, so how do you define the variance? Now that we have the expectation value, we can define variance, right? Yes. How is it defined with respect to A?
Expected value of A square minus expected value of A whole square.
Is it that, or is it expectation of A minus expectation A the whole squared?
Both the things. I mean, both the things are same.
So this is how it's defined. Guys, you have to correct me if I'm wrong. This is fine, this definition?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay, so this is the expectation of how, so the question is how much does a given instance of A deviate from its expectation value, right? Now, when I write something like this, those of you who are seeing this for the first time should stop and ask me, what is this that you have written? Because this is an operator, correct? What is this? That's a number. So how does it make sense what I've written? So the idea is that this is A minus expectation A times identity, the whole squared, and the expectation of this, right? In a particular state size. So in this operator language, we like to write the variance as the expectation of a particular operator, which is A minus mean value times I the whole squared. And it will be left for you to check that this indeed gives you expectation A squared minus expectation A the whole squared, which is what I think Nilesh was talking about, right? So this is a standard definition of the variance, right? So these two definitions should match. And of course, all of this with this reference to state psi. So this is the quantity on the left-hand side of the uncertainty principle, right? I have taken the square root of this and that gives you the standard deviation. If you want to write it in terms of variance, then you simply put a square everywhere and you put a square on the right-hand side as well. Remember, the denominator becomes a 4 there, okay? Right, so now what is this telling you? So what does a standard deviation or variance characterize? This characterizes the spread of a probability distribution. right? So what the left-hand side of the uncertainty principle is telling us is, if I take the spread of the sigma x distribution and I take the spread of the sigma z distribution, I cannot make this product vanish because this lower bound is not 0, right? It is not 0, rather it is some non-trivial number, right? So there's only so much that I can simultaneously narrow down the distributions of the spread of the distributions of x and z, right? In particular, if I try to narrow it down in the z direction, then it becomes a uniform distribution in the x direction and the other way around, right? So what this is lower bounding for you is so this spread of the probability distribution is what Heisenberg thought is a good measure of what is called the uncertainty in the value of the observable. How spread out this probability distribution is tells us something about how uncertain we are about the outcome, right? If this is like a uniform distribution, right? So there are just two values out here. So if I want to write P and the values, then if both are a half, right? So then it's a uniform distribution. Then we know that we are highly uncertain about the outcome. On the other hand, if it's a delta distribution, right? If it's just this, which is just 1, right? Then we know that we are highly certain about the value of the outcome, right? So this spread of the distribution tells us how certain or uncertain we are about the value of the observable, okay? So this is the statement of the uncertainty principle. And like I said, it's a simple linear algebra exercise to prove it. And that's part of the assignment. And this physically, you can sort of get a sense of this by doing these kind of sequential measurements of so-called incompatible observables, okay? Incompatible observables essentially are those which do not commute, right? And so this commutator does not vanish, right? So the commutator sigma x, sigma z, and this again is part of your assignment, you will show that this is not 0. And this then is an indication that they are incompatible because you cannot get a trivial lower bound on the uncertainty relation. Okay? Right. So, questions? Okay, so if there are no questions, let me just take a couple of more minutes to mention something, and then we'll continue discussing that in the next class. So what we have discussed so far, like I said, is what's called a projective measurement. Okay. And what the projective measurement does is it projects down to one of a set of orthogonal states. Or orthogonal projectors. But is this the most general measurement that one can construct, right? If I abstract out the idea of measurement, then do I really need orthogonal projectors, or can I go beyond orthogonal projectors? Now, why would I want to go beyond orthogonal projectors? So here is a simple task that I will leave you with. This is one of a so-called, two-party quantum game. Okay? And goes by the name of state discrimination. So the game is the following. I have two people. I don't like to call them Alice and Bob, so I will call them Anita and Bharat. I think that's the name I've used in your assignment as well. So I have two people, Anita and Bharat, and Anita is going to prepare either Ket 0 or Ket plus in her lab. Okay. And they both are separated somehow spatially, okay? And they have a quantum communication line between them. So Anita can send whatever state she prepares to Bharat, okay? And Bharat's task is to identify which state she prepared. Okay. So now we come to an example of a quantum information processing task where all of these ideas that you discussed about measurement will come to play an important role. Okay. So the question is, can Bharat win this game? Now, what does winning the game mean? I have to define that. Suppose I make it the hardest possible case where I say that you have to be able to identify the state each time accurately. Okay. Can Bharat win this game? So how will you think about this? So what can Bharat do in his lab? He's getting a single qubit state each time from Anita. So what can Bharat do? Can he win this game? Okay, so think about this. Let me stop here and we'll discuss this, continue to discuss this tomorrow. Okay, questions or answers to solve this two-party game? Okay, so do we still have a significant fraction of the class left? Okay, guys, those who were not there at the beginning, I'm extending the assignment deadline because, as I said, I have not managed to complete all the things which I wanted to discuss, which will, help you to solve the assignment. So, for example, we discussed uncertainty principle today. Similarly, we'll discuss the idea of what is called a POVM, which, forms the last problem in your assignment. And this two-party game is very much at the heart of it, these kind of two-party games. So let's discuss this on Monday, right? And the assignment you will have till, I think, September 8th or 9th to submit, not 5th. Okay, so you get a few more days extension. Okay, questions? All right, if there are no questions, then we just meet on Monday. Okay.